Alrighty everyone, hello, and welcome back to a early morning episode of my nonsense, and maybe also something of Belock's nonsense if he decides to come down. And this week I wanted to talk about something that I've seen come up quite a bit, which is the idea of finding a version of the Bible that maybe doesn't have all of the problematic stuff in it. So, let's get into it. I have a lot of thoughts about this topic, and we're hopefully going to come away from this video, all of us, knowing what the hell we're even doing with this crazy old text we call the Bible. But before we get into all that, hello again. If you are new here, my name is Sarah Streisand. I am a Christian witch, a writer, content creator, educator, all these other wonderful things, and specifically a writer of this book right here, Discovering Christian Witchcraft, which is quite literally your one-stop shop into figuring out what the hell the title Christian Witch even means. And of course, outside the book, if you do like all these kinds of topics about Christian witchcraft and just talking about theology and the Bible and magic and all these other kinds of things, definitely go ahead and like the video, subscribe, hit the bell, all that good stuff so you get these videos every single week. If you are not new here, welcome back. Hello, how are you? Thank you for stopping by. And remember, for everyone here, if you want to see these videos 2 weeks early and ad-free, all you gotta do is head over to my Patreon where I post these early and a lot more. So check that out. But without further ado, let's get into this conversation. So, I understand this desire, right? I understand why people have this wish in a modern world, in a modern context, to get a version of the Bible that doesn't say all the crazy stuff that certain denominations say that it does, right? Especially because in this day and age, there's not exactly a shortage of people trying to not only organize their own lives by some pretty weird understandings of a literally ancient text, but make laws affecting everyone else's life too. Which is why this whole concept of Christianity, of witchcraft, of especially Christian witchcraft, is inherently political. It's inherently political. There's no way around this. We have a lot of people right now really doing everything they can to push their specific lens of Christianity onto literally everyone else in America, and that's not awesome. Most evangelical books that we have read together on this channel, be they ones against witchcraft or just general ones like that one on deconstruction, they'll tell you things like, being gay being a sin, which it is not, and, how you can't be a witch because insert really rote baseline reading of a translation of an ancient text here, right? All these weird things where not only are these things flat out wrong, but have been used to cause harm. There's a reason that the rates of depression and also, self-deletion are as high as they are in the LGBTQ community, and it's not because they're part of the LGBTQ community. It's because people use things like religion to justify throwing folks out of the house, berating folks, sending them to conversion therapy camps, and all these other terrible things, all in the name of religion, specifically the Christian religion. And when you ask them to justify these thoughts, of course, they'll be pulling up all kinds of scriptures. I could talk about the witch stuff all day, that is kind of my bread and butter, but there is definitely more than that, right? People have used plenty of clobber verses to decide that women should shut up and never speak, or that, again, being part of the LGBTQ community is a terrible, terrible thing, or anything else in between. They've used it to justify these kind of cult-like environments where you really have to be exactly to the letter of all of these 1,000,002 rules and not actually just focus on the literal one commandment Jesus ever gave. It's even been used to justify the institution of American slavery, as you might imagine, and as might be easy to imagine given that slavery exists in the Bible pretty candidly and pretty straightforwardly.
There he is! Oh, it's a booba man! Yes! Hello, baby!
Evil man, evil man, evil man, evil man. What? But when we start asking questions like, is there a Bible that just doesn't have all these problematic things? The unfortunate answer to this question is no. Because the thing about it is that the Bible is an ancient text, as I've said multiple times already. It was written at the latest about 2,000 years ago, if we're talking about the New Testament. 2,000 years is a long time for social understandings and cultural customs and norms to change, and language to change, and entire empires to rise and fall again. So while the wish to see a modern Bible, I guess, that more accurately reflects God's Spirit is understandable, it still is misguided. Because the reality is that all of this that is in the Bible, from the Jewish Bible, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, to the New Testament, is part of the story of God and the story of God's people. What I can tell you, though, is that the way people interpret certain verses to hurt LGBTQ people or anything else is not necessarily what the Bible actually meant, for that same reason, though. Because this is an ancient text dealing with completely different cultural customs, social norms, and everything else, you can pretty much guarantee that when the Bible says something like, "Thou shalt not lie with man as with woman," it has nothing to do with the modern understanding of being part of the LGBTQ community that we currently have. And when we see things like slavery in the Bible, we got to remember that that was there before anything related to Judaism or Christianity even began. In fact, you could see that right literally in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Abraham, before he even remotely enters a covenant with God, already has a slave. This is therefore an institution that already existed. It's not something that like just popped up or that God created. It was already there. And here's the thing. When you look into scholarship of the Bible and of the cultures around the, whole start of the Israelites and everything else, like this book does, which is a fantastic book, by the way, you learn that, that was literally just what everyone was doing at the time. And in fact, God actually was kind of progressive in the way that all of the rules of how to have a slave were not held by other cultures at the time. Obviously, there's no real good way to have slaves. We know this now in the modern era. But back then, when that was an institution, and where if God had wholesale just said stop doing that anymore, the entire economic system of the time would have just collapsed, God still in Exodus put in rules that distinguished them from other cultures. Whereas the Code of Hammurabi distinguished slaves as little more than chairs or objects, really just property that would only require some monetary damages if they were hurt or killed, the Bible said that is still a person, enslaved or not. If you kill your slave, you are to be put to death, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you're looking at the Bible from a modern lens, you're never going to know things like that. You're never going to see things like that. But when you judge back in time like that, you're doing it such a disservice because you're not getting the full context of the situation. You're not realizing that while these laws about slavery in modern era are really, really bad, back then they were actually like super progressive liberal for the time, which is crazy to consider, but you have to consider that. And when it comes to all those things that people use clobber verses for against the LGBTQ community or against women or anything else, you've got books like What Paul Really Said About Women, which is fantastic. You've got books like God and the Gay Christian, right, that kind of help put these back in their cultural context, that help us understand why the way people use these verses in modern era does not make any sense in the original context of what was being said, of what was being written, and everything else in between. So it really gets to the point where there's no need for a Bible that doesn't have all of these, super mean and nasty things like that, because that wasn't even what was originally intended in the first place. That has nothing to do with the price of tea in China, basically, when it comes to that kind of stuff. What we now cast onto this text with our modern understanding halfway across the world from where it originally spawned, I don't think, when you say it out loud, it becomes obvious, right? This isn't going to work. Which is also why when these Christians say, nope, the Bible's all you need, you don't need scholarship, you don't need anyone to explain it to you, it's all just right there in black and white, that's not true. Has no bearing. Because when you translate a text for 2,000 years into so many different languages and interpret it through the modern lens we have now, you're going to get the wrong stuff out of it. Obviously, we don't have the cultural customs and norms that they did 2,000 years ago in the Levant. Therefore, trying to follow a Bible, a religious text that is not talking to us, it's a little difficult, it's a little challenging. However, right, even all of the social issues aside, like, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, everything else, some people still stop and say, okay, but wait, like, didn't God still command all of this terrible stuff, like Sodom and Gomorrah, where like the whole town died, and like, all these wars, like Jericho, and like the whole book of Numbers is kind of basically like the book of war crimes. Like, what's going on with that? Well, these are things you have to understand in the context of the time, right? It's not just about social issues. It's also about the fact that, again, as I've said 18 times already probably, this is a different time period with a different culture, with different people, with different needs. And when we talk about God and all of the crazy stuff that goes on in there, all the war and all the death and all of this and all of that, you gotta understand that God started as a war god. And that war gods, whether they were, right, the one we know as Yahweh, the one we know as the head of the entire Abrahamic religious systems over here, or whether they were gods like Anat or Baal-Hadad or any of these other war gods, they would do things like that because a culture who was constantly at risk of being invaded and having their lands taken from them had to have war gods that could absolutely destroy everybody. Part of what made a people feel safe and protected was having gods that were capable of that kind of great violence. And to the point that they would actually, when going to war with one another, all these many tribes, they would pick up icons or images or any representations of their god to the battlefield to signify that that god was there with them. That was a massive intimidation against their opponents, right? To have their main god or their war god there to absolutely destroy everything on the battlefield. And of course, later in their myths, all of this great destruction would get attributed to them, like in the stories of Anat, or if we go to Egypt, right, the stories of Sekhmet and all these other kinds of gods. To blame a war god for doing all these destructions and terrible, terrible things is like blaming a dog for chasing a cat or digging a hole. It just doesn't make sense to be mad about that, But if you only ever read the Bible and you don't ever get any other context or scholarship, you're never going to be able to appreciate things in that kind of perspective. Which is why, no, you're not going to get a Bible that just cuts out the story of God and his people. You're not going to get a Bible that just sanitizes the history of how people understood God and what they, wanted from him and how they engaged with him. You're never going to get that. All you're going to get is context by studying these kinds of things. And it's your job as a modern believer to grapple with that, to understand how this whole thing evolved and why. Then we can all stop saying things like Old Testament God mean, New Testament God nice, because the reality is they're the same God with the same propensity for both love and tenderness and war and death in both testaments. I mean, hell, people will always say that God is so much nicer in the New Testament because Jesus, but like Jesus actually like whips the shit out of people in life, and then also the Holy Spirit comes and kills people in Acts. So like, what do you mean God suddenly lost his teeth like a grandpa losing his dentures in the New Testament? The entire book of Revelation, I rest my case. As modern believers, right, what we have to do is try and understand the root of how everything gets so messy to begin with. Would God need to do all these violent, terrible things if there wasn't, like, I don't know, a neighboring army at the door trying to break in? Would all of these rules need to be there if people already knew how to be cool? I mean, literally after the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Exodus, Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Leviticus, whatever. I get the order messed up, but basically this, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, there we go. Once you get past that, which is pretty much the cornerstone of like, hey, how to exist, how to be a tribe that God can deal with, the rest is just people fucking it up and God saying, hey, stop fucking it up over and over and over and over again. I mean, how are you going to look at something like Amos chapter 8 How are you going to see that and understanding the context, knowing that these people were ripping people off, selling people into debt slavery, doing these unfair, foul practices, and see any difference from the modern day where people are stuck with suppressed wages and sitting here in debt slavery, basically? How are we going to say things have really changed that much, right? How are we going to say that we don't cause our own problems? How is it God's fault that things are bad and not ours for fucking up the stuff he said to do over and over and over again, right? Even as modern believers, you got to do something of like a little English class exercise here, right? You got to be able to read the text and pull out the core ideas. And that is how you engage with the Bible and apply it in a modern context, right? The core ideas of any of these clobber verses against the LGBTQ community had nothing to do with orientation. Because orientation wasn't a thing, a concept that existed back then. It had everything to do with an affront to the power dynamics of society and using basically that kind of eshul stuff as a weapon to humiliate and debase other people. You're gonna find God's got way more of a problem with how the IDF deals with the people they're abusing in Palestine than two dudes holding hands at the park. Okay. Likewise, if we were really going to organize our society on Christian values, then we wouldn't have interest rates on debt, right? And all debts would be forgiven every 7 years. We would, leave tons of food in the field for the poor. We would have all of these safeguards and safety nets so that the poorest of the poor still had food to eat, shelter, clothes, and everything else. But we don't, because people are too interested in getting lost in the details of all the stuff Paul ever said, which they're not even interpreting correctly, than actually following, again, literally the one commandment Jesus ever fucking gave. Love one another is very broad, very vague, and has nothing to do with whether or not someone ends up in heaven and hell at this point. It has everything to do with, do you see someone in need and help them? And only by studying this kind of context and by getting good study Bibles that have the good scholarship, the good explanations in them, are you not only going to, get some context for what's going on and why these things were happening the way they were happening back then, but also figure out how to pull out the core ideas, which is that God really fucking hates injustice. God hates injustice. God hates abuse of the defenseless, right? The poor and the widows, the orphans, all of them. God hates that kind of shit. And he gets really fucking mad at societies that ignore him for long enough. His son came down and said, you need to do this. You need to love one another. And we are still fucking that up. And it's only by God's grace and mercy that we don't continuously get roiled. But when we do still get roiled, it's not because of God. It's because of the consequences of our own actions, right? Those are the absolute, if I boil the Bible down to nothing else, everything in there boils down to God hates watching people suffer. He hates watching innocent people suffer. He hates that we do this to each other, and he wishes we would get our shit together. That's quite literally the entire Bible. The entire Bible is God says love one another, and he hates when we don't. It hurts him. It hurts us. That's it. It's just that back then, they had different ideas of what hurts or whatnot, right? Like institutions like slavery, they were institutions just like banks or anything else that we have in our modern day that we take for granted. Back then, they took slavery for granted as an institution. Things have evolved since then. We continue to learn, we continue to grow, we continue to push towards this vision that God, if you actually look at the Bible, seems to have always been pushing us towards, seems to have always been getting us closer to, right? If we start off saying, sure, you can have slaves, but you have to treat them like people, and that's already a radical departure from what was, and then later we have there's neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. Well, now we're all equal. Now we keep pushing towards this world that God has been trying to get us towards since the beginning, right? We keep progressing. In fact, progress is the very nature of the Bible. When they say the Bible doesn't change and God doesn't change, that's true, because God has always been one that's trying to push us towards this world where we are all together, loving one another, happy with one another, right? This is not a radical idea. This is not changing the gospel or the Bible to say that. This is quite literally the manifestation of what the gospel and what the Bible's original goal always was. But people don't understand that because they don't do their research. And they need to do their research. So yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow. It's a hard thing to wrap your head around. The idea that, you know, the Bible is what it is. But again, we're modern believers of an ancient faith. It's not going to make sense to a modern eye. It's only going to make sense to an ancient eye. And we have to continuously not find a new Bible that sanitizes God and takes all of his past away from him, but instead put that past into context and understand the analogous ways these things apply to us. We can't just sit here and update and change everything to be more palatable. We have to do the work of understanding why things were the way they were and what it actually means when you boil it down for humanity. Even for all the craziness in it, I don't have a problem with it because I understand that this was a different time with different cultural customs, with different values, with different people, and that for all those different values that God had to work with in order to get people on board with him, the core message of being good and just and righteous and loving to one another has always been there, pushing us forward. Heaven is not a utopia we have to wait for when we die. The kingdom of God, Jesus says himself, is not in the sky. It's not in the ocean. It's not anywhere else. It's right here with us. It's already here. We have to make it what it's supposed to be here on earth as it is in heaven. That's our job. And every day we use the Bible to justify making it more like hell instead is a day we fail. Is a day we fail miserably. So no, don't run away from all of these horrible things in the Bible. Don't try to take them away. Don't sanitize them. Don't make God something that he's not and dilute the infinite and ineffable and all-encompassing being that he is. Instead, have the bravery to face that stuff head on and grapple with it, wrestle with it, understand why, understand how, understand what it means for the people who originally wrote this stuff. Otherwise, you're only ever going to get a shadow of all that God really is. And that does both you and him an injustice. So, with all that said, I wish you guys a great rest of your week, and I will see you next time for more good chats. See ya!